Hello. In this lecture, we will explore Etruscan art. The Etruscans were active somewhere between 800 BCE and about 500 BCE. The dates listed at the top, 750 to 300, are the dates that are usually prescribed to Etruscan art, but we don't know a great deal about the Etruscans. And what we do know comes to us through other sources, through most notably the Romans and Roman historians, and through some Greek historians who had interaction with the Etruscans. It's hard for us to put exact dates on their culture because of the nature of when um, they lived and their particular practices. We don't have as many direct examples of their text and direct examples of their own histories as we do with some of the other cultures. Now, um, there's some questions around Etruscan art that have led to a lot of confusion um, as to who did what first and who influenced whom. Um, because of the nature of what their culture looked like and um, how they created works and what they valued. There's a lot of Etruscan culture, seemingly, in what will become later the Greek and then the Greco-Roman culture. So who did what first? Well, it's not as important as an issue because all of these cultures are interrelated. It is definitely a question that historians have wrestled with over the years. Um, because of the location where the Etruscan cities developed in northern Italy, that influenced a lot of their decisions about the materials that they used to build from and with. It influenced a lot of their art and culture in a way that we don't see further to the south in the Mediterranean and the Aegean cultures. Um, this map shows the influence of the Etruscan League in around the year 500 or so, which is when the Etruscans were at their kind of high point. Now, the red dots with the green circles are actual full-fledged members of the Etruscan League, and then the red dots without the circles are other Etruscan cities that had never been established fully as members of that league. Now, being a member of the league meant that citizens of those cities could could count on and benefit from the the rights and privileges of being a citizen of Etruria. Now, what that meant is that they could move freely, they could expect protection, that they had rights of ownership, that they had rights of property, that they had rights of in order of trade, and that they could interact freely amongst the other Etruscan cities without having to worry about the fair practices. That was a big deal because the Etruscans really are the first culture to have a more egalitarian viewpoint of trade and commerce. The Greeks, as we looked at, are usually credited with the foundations of democracy, but the Greek democracy was a very, very limited democracy. It was limited only to those voting senators, and it really only benefited them. So it was broader than other ancient cultures where the nobility extended only to the very, very top. It really extended that in Greek culture, but it's with the Etruscans and the Romans where we'll see a much wider segment of the population that enjoys rights and that enjoys the privileges of participating in the expression of that idea of democracy. Now, um, there are a few most important Etruscan cities culturally. Arezzo it was a very important cultural center, and Veii was just north and east of Rome was a very important cultural center. Many um, of the artifacts that we found, the sculptures, the tombs, are located in these centers. Because of the nature of the way that they built and the way that they and the materials they used to build, mostly wood, we don't have very many of their structures. Most of what we have are in ruin, and we see just the stone foundations of what at one point would have been wooden structures. Now, unlike other cultures that used a different form of architecture and a different style of building based upon what the structure was, for the Etruscans, they tended to use the same building practices for everything, whether it was a tomb or a home or a temple. And we see a lot of influence here that you could make the argument comes from Aegean structures, comes from Greek structures, a little bit of mix in of what we might think of later as Roman style, although the Romans were probably influenced by the Etruscans because the Romans saw the Etruscans as their forebears, as their ancestors. We'll get to why that's kind of ironic in a minute. But the reconstruction model that you see in the bottom right of what this temple originally would have looked like shows us that they definitely used columns to create these porched entryways or porticos in a way similar to the columns that we might have seen at an Aegean temple at Knossos. They're not pure Doric, although they have that Doric element where they're wider at the base than they are at the top. Um, and it's important that we notice that um, it's a combination of functional design and aesthetic design. So the the form here has that triangle shaped roof because a pediment because it's farther to the north, and so they get snow in the winters, and so the building needs to shed that snow, but it's open on the end rather than closed with sculpture because they're using that they want in the summertime they want to use that space to allow the heat of the to escape to make it cooler inside, and in the winter they have fire. They have central fire pits, and they have torches and stuff. So they need to allow the the smoke from those fires to escape. So it's a practical thing. It's not just a matter of aesthetics, but they really did think and care a great deal about the functionality of their buildings. Um, these the Etruscans, for the most part, were not a overly wealthy society. I mean, they did have wealth, but they weren't as widespread and as influential as some of the other cultures that surrounded them. But they were influential in many ways. I think one of the ways that they were most influential is how they saw, because they didn't have as big a gap between sort of the middle class, the lower middle class, the skilled labor class, and the nobility, that they didn't see that art and culture was solely about just that top tier of society. They put their effort culturally into a more kind of clan or family based practices. So we see a lot of focus on family tombs. We see a strong focus on structures that were used across the levels of society instead of art and culture and the most important parts of art and culture solely being for the top uh, part of society. Now, we see there's some other little details that you'll see that you can definitely see a Greek influence along the cornice or frieze. There's a Greek key design, the use of sculpture along the roof line and at the ends of the pediment. The structure of the temple itself is basically a Greek temple design, but the other details that are really truly Etruscan, the structure itself and the way that it's built, the use of a combination of wood and fresco and stone, all working together to create the structure. So they were more open to influence from lots of different cultures, not solely coming up with their own practices. Now, as I said, we don't really have any buildings that survived that were purely Etruscan. There were Roman recreations and rebuildings of Etruscan buildings that came later, but we really see those as Roman. The only, in terms of architecture and surviving structures, that we can purely identify as Etruscan are the tombs. Now, what you're looking at here is called the Bonditaccia. It's the most famous complex of Etruscan tombs that survives. And it is a mixture of tombs created over centuries. There's a variety of architectural forms here. There are tombs that are conical, like the one you see here in the foreground, that have a cylinder foundation that's covered with a dome, and then the dome is covered with earth and is planted with ground cover, a heather that flowers at a special time of the year. And that was a very common tomb form. There's also a tomb that is again built into the ground, kind of low to the ground, with a flat roof, more more typical temple form from the earlier prehistoric peoples that we saw, like on Malta. These forms were quite common. That it makes sense that they would have built this way, because we think that these people were ethnically and genetically the descendants of the same people that inhabited Malta, the same people that inhabited the Aegean and Mycenaean, but they had actually moved farther north several thousand years before the Etruscan culture is established, following herds of prey and as hunter-gatherers. And then the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE, had pushed them back south, and they had settled first in what is today Germany and Austria, and then they'd been pushed further and further south, where they created across the mountains and into this very, very fertile region, what we know today as Tuscany. And they had established the first widespread use of farming and cultivation of crops and animals in this region, and that led to their permanently settling this region, which is why they share more in common with people from the north ethnically and genetically than they do from the people of the Mediterranean. The Etruscans were taller on average. They were fairer complected. They had a lot of times they had lighter skin, hair, and eye color than the people of what we think of as Southern Italians. Northern Italians today tend to be more like look more like that than their southern Italian neighbors do. So as we explore these tombs, what we find is that their way of building the tomb, it was a reflection of how we believe of how they built their homes. So when you enter an Etruscan tomb, it's as if you're entering an Etruscan home. They built their homes into the earth to make them, you walk down into a tomb the way you walk down into their home, and it was to provide more insulation for winter and cooler in the summer. It was also to provide a bit more security, so that the region that still has a lot of earthquakes, that the houses were less likely to fall down. They were more stable. It also the way that they lived was very communal. So the tomb is a reflection of that as well. Extended families, cousins, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, all lived together in one communal home. And the tomb is set up much the same way. So these wouldn't have been individuals' tombs. These would have been the tombs for a family. And then inside, there would have been individual burial chambers, that for certain individuals who could afford it, who had established a great deal of wealth, they might have had their own sarcophagus. We'll look at a few of those. But then for the most part, they would have used the tombs as a place to lay the bodies in state, and then later return and take the bones and store them into the mausoleum inside the tomb. Now, whether the tomb has a dome shape or a flat shape, the interior structure is much the same. These would have had at one point stone doors to seal and cover, at least temporarily. These were used by multiple generations, so the doors had to be able to be removed and taken off and put back. And many of them, the doors have been lost to history at this point. But the structures themselves are reminiscent of other structures that we've seen in various other ancient cultures, like the mastaba in early Egypt, like the tombs of Mesopotamia, like the tombs of the prehistoric peoples that we already discussed. Now, on the interior, this is basically a rock-cut tomb. So they start out with these large formations of rock, and they carve the tomb out of that solid rock. This area here would have been used to lie the deceased body in state after it was wrapped ritually for burial. It would have been cleansed and then wrapped in a burial shroud of linen and prepared, and then the body lied in state for up to a year, usually about a year, which was long enough for the body to decompose to the point where it was just a skeleton. And then the family would return and ritually take the bones and divide them and place them for burial in bone boxes. Certain special individuals might be buried independently. Others, their bones collected and buried communally, depending upon their status in the family. Now, a lot of the details that we see here, we think are reminiscent of the way that they built their homes. For instance, in the roof here, the carving of these beams, we think, show how they would have built their homes. There would have been these low ceilings with beams to create an upper story that could have been used for both storage and or sleeping accommodations for children, kind of a loft space. As we move through the different tombs, what we find are a lot of architectural details that we think not only are they reminiscent of their homes, like the niches that you see in the walls that they would have used in the homes for decoration, they would have used for storage, could have used for a number of different purposes, but also we think that what's missing in a lot of these tombs is painted decoration. Now there are some where it survives, but in many it's been lost to history and time. They would have painted the interiors of both their homes and the tombs with frescoes, painting on thin layers of wet plaster. When the plaster dries, the painting becomes part of the wall. And they painted scenes of everyday life. They painted scenes of the deceased and of the family. They painted scenes that represented allegorically the family or the traits of the family members who had died. And in some of the tombs, elements of those survive. This is one such example. This is called the Tomb of the White Leopards. And we think that white leopard is a symbol for the family. Families didn't have surnames. There wasn't a family name, so to speak, in a lot of the ancient world. In fact, that carried forward. Only nobility had family names. In many cases, throughout the much of the medieval world and into the Renaissance. It wasn't until after the Renaissance in the Baroque world where we start to see surnames become more common. So that white leopard would have represented the family whose tomb this is symbolically, and they would have worn that on their clothing, incorporated it into the decorations of their homes, and it really is a precursor to what we know of as family crests that were popular and common all throughout Europe. Now, the scene that's being depicted shows what was probably for them a pretty typical family scene. They're seated on these low kind of lounging cushions. They're celebrating. They're having a kind of a feast, a family meal, dinner. The depiction style is that distorted perspective that we saw common in Egyptian art. But the details have some influence you can see from Greek culture, and some of the show that they probably had some communication and connection with the Greeks, which would make sense because the Etruscans were they were a trade-based economy. So they were farmers, and raisers of animals and livestock and producers of wine and olive oil, and they traded that. Then traded that with their Mediterranean neighbors, and that's really how they generated most of their wealth. So, and this is an example of the fresco that I talked about. And you can see the process itself. By painting onto the plaster, it creates this intense, rich color that lasts for a very long time unless it's disturbed. The only real way to destroy it is to chip it away. At the bottom edges, you can see where some of it has fallen away, or humidity and time have kind of taken their toll, and it's broken off. But the color remains very vibrant and rich for a long time. Now, this is one of the most unique tombs ever found, but especially for the Etruscans. It's called the Tomb of the Reliefs, and all of the details that you see carved on the wall in relief that kind of show the common everyday household sort of items, from tools and equipment to things that, toys and things that they would use for the family, and suggestion of books and suggestion of things that they used as they lived their life every day. All of that gives us a really unique insight into the way they lived, not just how they viewed the afterlife. Those niches in the walls where there look to be stacks of pillows, we think that that's actually how they lived in their homes, that they had, instead of having separate rooms for sleeping, that they had these kind of niches built into the walls around the edges, of the communal room, and that's where they would sleep, and they would just draw curtains to close off their sleeping quarters. And so then in this tomb, that's where they would have lied those bodies in state, while they were decomposing to skeleton. So this is a really unique, and important opportunity for us in this tomb to kind of see not only how they treated the dead, but also how they lived. Now, many of the other objects that we found that are purely Etruscan, we found either in tombs or around tombs, because those are the only places that were ever found intact, left behind. And many of those, the objects were removed long before the Common Era, so it's hard to know for certain, you know, to separate out Etruscan from Roman. But there's some telltale signs of Etruscan. First of all, the incorporation and the elevation of the status of women. It's, by all our reckoning, when we look at what's written about them, women held perhaps not fully equal, but close to equal status to men in Etruscan society. Women are honored in a way that, both artistically, culturally, and socially, that no other culture allowed them that level of status. Here's an example of a double sarcophagus. So here what we have is the sarcophagus of a couple, and the carving shows that they were buried together, and that they were partners in life, not just married. They viewed marriage similarly to the way that we today view marriage, as a relationship between a single man and a single woman, and not that men would not have multiple wives like many of their ancient neighbors did, and that the women played a very important role in society. Women um, could be landowners, women could be property owners, women could hold occupations, women could own businesses. Women played an equal role, and that was very important to the way that they saw each other. You know, that women had an important uh, or made an important contribution to society, and so as such they should be honored in a way that transcended their just their gender. Now, as far as the depiction goes here, because of the functional nature of this object, the two deceased bodies are actually buried inside, and you can see that um, the bodies of the two figures here are elongated. Their legs are stretched much longer so that than they would be, just typically anatomically, so that to provide room for the bodies inside. Now, we also notice with their carving and their sculpture that just like we saw with the Greek, much more so really than we saw with the Aegean, which is several hundred years earlier than the Etruscans, we see a much higher level of relief. We see sculpture in the round intended to be viewed from 360 degrees. We see a higher level of realism, and we see a closer attention to detail that really does suggest the element of portraiture. This isn't just two idealized figures. This is a couple, and this is supposed to be them. It really is supposed to be a portrait of the deceased. And that's very important because it shows that they're not just valuing them in the idealization of what they perhaps look like in death or in the afterlife, but they're valuing who they were as they lived. Now, there are areas, especially what we think of as kind of the tail end of true Etruscan culture as it's transitioning to becoming part of the Roman Republic, where there's a very strong Greek influence. And that probably comes to them through the city of Adria. Adria is on the sea, and it's a very important port city. The Etruscans and the Etruscan League were very much, even though they're centered in northern Italy, doesn't in that region, doesn't mean that they didn't travel outside that. These people were traders, and they traded their goods and produce all over, not only the Etruscan League but outside with their neighbors, and so they would have definitely had some contact with the Greeks, and they were inspired and influenced by Greek art and culture. We see some of that influence in the tombs. A lot of similarity between uh, tombs, between late Etruscan tombs and Roman Republican tombs. They're carved in marble rather than wood. Um, the the details speak to that influence. For instance, the Etruscan woman here, whose tomb this is, she is depicted as having a very Greek style. She's wearing Greek clothing, Greek jewelry. It's really showing off that Greek influence. Now, um, the realism of Etruscan carving is remarkable. I think that at the same time that what we see with what's happening with the Greek, it's actually Etruscan realism in carving is slightly ahead of the Greek. Now, we often will kind of debate about who did what first and who's more influential upon whom. But I think that it's interesting when you compare objects that we date to be at about the same time. Um, the Etruscans are significantly ahead in terms of their skill and technique and realism. At this level of carving, what's happening at the same time in Greece is the Archaic period, so it's more stiff and formal and not nearly as realistic. Now, what's also interesting about Etruscan art is their connection and love of casting. They cast very heavily in bronze, but even when we see works that are other works that are made in differing styles that shows the influence of casting. So when they carve in marble or carve in stone or work in ceramic or clay, it shows the influence of that realism of casting, and how from casting a subject you get more detail and more realism, and they want to carry that into their carved works as well. Um, the We also see ethnically, when you look at the details of the face, we see what looks to be more that Roman style. The figures have what's known as the Roman nose. The bridge of the nose is more vertical. It's straighter. It's more pronounced. The brow is more pronounced. The jaw is square rather than rounded. The lips are fuller. So that really is what's known as ethnically as the Roman shape and form to the face. And so, these people are in some ways the precursors to the Romans, although they didn't really see themselves as such. Rome was founded and was around during the high point of the Etruscan League, but Rome was never accepted as a full member of the Etruscan League. In fact, um, the main Etruscans viewed Rome as slightly uncivilized and uncultured. They really didn't see that they had developed to the point as being as deserving of joining Etruria. So this gives you an example, an idea of what's happening sculpturally all at the same time. So the two figures on either side of the central figure are both objects that we've looked at previously when we looked at Greece. And they show the high points of sculpture that's being made in the late archaic, early classical period. At the same time, the figure in the center is something similar in terms of form, and shows the similar level of skill, actually perhaps slightly more advanced level of skill of the Etruscans. It's some significant differences. It's not carved, it's cast in bronze. And it really shows the attention to detail. You see that, when you look at the drapery of the clothing and the way that all the little details, the folds, and the way it kind of hugs the body, you see that both examples show an attention to that, but it seems to match the form a bit more closely with the Etruscan. Now, there are a few iconic images that and objects that have, over the years in history, that have come to symbolize cultures, and this is one of those. This is called the she-wolf, sometimes referred to as the Capitoline wolf. Um, it's it's a bronze, and it's an object that the Romans later embraced as a symbol of Rome and copied it over and over and spread it all throughout the Republic and then into the Empire as a symbol of Roman history and Roman culture. And they really completely changed its content and its meaning by doing so. Initially, it was made as something of an insult. So what you see here is a sculpture based upon the myth of the founding of the city of Rome. The story goes, that two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, were abandoned at birth by their mother. Now, there's lots of different versions of the story. There's one version where she takes one look at them and decides they're evil and kills herself. There's another version where she dies in childbirth and saves them by putting them in a basket. There's another version that has them as not necessarily being evil, but she leaves them because she has no way to feed them or support them, and so she just gives them up to nature to deal with, and then just abandons them. But regardless, the point is that they are abandoned at birth, And they're discovered by a she-wolf who has recently given birth to a litter of pups. And instead of, carrying the babies off and eating them, she decides that she's going to care for them and nurture them. Now, if you've ever heard the cliche of somebody being asked if they were raised by wolves, this is where that comes from. So when we say somebody's raised by wolves, what we're saying about them is that they're uncivilized, that they don't know how to behave, to rightly behave. So this sculpture was actually cast and given to the city of Rome by the Etruscans as a sign of their lack of civilization, their lack of culture. So what they were saying to him is, you all were raised by wolves. We're not going to let you into our league of cities because you don't have the right breeding and you don't have the right training. Now, the story goes on that Romulus and Remus, this is partly why it was so negative, is that they survive and then they grow up to become criminals. And they're cast out of every good, righteous city that they enter as criminals. They stop just short of getting caught, at least, of murder, which would have meant their death. But, they were definitely kicked out and banned from entering, banished from the cities, from any decent city that would have them. And so they decide, well, we'll just round up all the other folks like us who are opportunistic and trying to make, get ahead, and we'll create our own, what eventually, will be considered a gang. And so that gang gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and they decide they need a hideout. So they scan the area and they find this little kind of out of the way place surrounded by 7 hills, which provides plenty of opportunities to post lookouts, and that becomes their hideout. And that's basically the city of Rome. Now it gets bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where it becomes an actual legitimate city. And at that point, where it gets bigger and bigger, the two brothers are ruling over this criminal, or it's more than that at this point, but group, and they're wielding a lot of power in the region. And so they, instead of sharing the power, as is typical of siblings and brothers, they fight over it, and they decide, and they fight to the death. And Romulus kills Remus, and hence the city of Rome is named after Romulus. Now, for the Etruscans, they saw this story as, a sign, a symbol of how awful and, backwards and kind of uncouth that the Romans were. The Romans turned it around and they embraced it, and they said, well, we're going to use this, as a symbol for our culture. And the reason they wanted to use it is because it sends this propaganda message. If you choose, think about the message that sends, right? If you choose this as your symbol, then you're going to, you're the people who see this, they think, well, the only person who would choose to be called raised by wolves, or this level of uncivility, is somebody who's maybe a little bit crazy. We don't want to mess with them. And so it's really a message of standoffishness, or a message of warning that, yeah, we are this crazy, so you don't want to mess with us, and we're strong and powerful enough to defeat you. So they turn that symbol of an insult around and make it one, a positive one, for the founding of their city. Now, these sculptures, these cast bronze, they became kind of popular in late Etruscan culture, and they're usually very allegorical, like the last one. They're trying to tell a myth or a story or a legend. They're usually very, very detailed, and the casting process involves carving either from a wax original or a more often probably a ceramic original that's then from which a mold is made, and then the bronze is poured into that mold to create the finished work. And then the work is, after it's cooled, it's polished and finished detail carving. This is the chimera. And this is, again, a particularly Etruscan, but then later absconded by the Romans, idea. This idea of the ultimate plague unleashed upon the world because of man's curiosity. And this weird hybrid figure that represents this plague. This then became a symbol for the Romans. The chimera was the Roman legion, that they took this as their symbol, that they were a plague on the earth, and that they were so powerful and strong that they could overcome anything, and they could not be defeated. Now, the chimera myth, the myth of the chimera is that it was a combination of a lion and a snake and a goat. And I get the lion and the snake, but the goat part I don't really get, other than them being kind of obstinate and tough. But the point is that it was these symbolic forms. As we transition from Etruscan to Roman, what we're going to see is that Rome embraces the power of symbols in a way that other cultures really didn't. And that love of symbols and the love of using art and culture as a metaphor for strength, a metaphor for whatever your message is. But that kind of art as propaganda is something that we're going to see that they're strongly influential on not only their own culture, but on culture to follow. So it's really the idea, that like we talked about with the Greeks in classicism, that classicism is all about realism and truth and the search for those things, whereas Romanticism, is what we're going to see eventually with through Roman Republican and then Empire art, is more about this message that truth is relative and that I can control the story and manipulate the story and ultimately manipulate what we think of as the truth. It doesn't matter how strong my army actually is, it's whether you believe that my army is strong enough to defeat you, and then you're going to be less willing to want to fight. And that's ultimately what the Romans borrow from the Etruscans. They take all these Etruscans symbols and they turn them into a message that fits their own purposes. Now, these are Etruscan figures of warriors that, like what we saw with the Greeks, and their images of the dying warriors, they show their purpose is something similar. It's supposed to be about man's commitment to support of society. But instead of showing the warrior as giving their life, it's really more about the warrior in battle, in combat, and showing the bravery and strength of the warrior in battle. At the end of a Roman's life, they asked one question. It wasn't so much, were you a good person? It was, how did you live? What were your acts? Because the Romans really were focused on the behavior of an individual, not necessarily in service to the group. No, this is a more Republican, more kind of individualistic approach. It's, did you, as an individual at your death, did you spend your time in your life wisely? Because if you did, then you were seen as living a good life. And then, but if you didn't, then you would be seen as wasting your life. It wasn't the Greek tragedy comedy. It was really more the question of a functional question of, did you use what time you had wisely, and did you show bravery and courage and honor? To the Romans, honor was everything. That the honor and glory that you added to your family and to yourself and to your name, your individual name, that's really what mattered. And so how you do that is, whatever your purpose in life, whatever you're living for, you need to make sure that you're living that to the fullest. So it's not about your death and did you die well in service of the group the way it was with the Greeks. It's how you lived that mattered most. Now, this is the Etruscan orator. And we're going to look at several examples of orators over the next couple of lectures because we see it first with the Etruscans, then we'll see a Roman Republican version, and then we'll see a Roman Empire version, and we'll see how this changes. The orator is an important role for the Etruscans. It's the first politicians, because remember, they're more egalitarian. More citizens have rights, including the right to vote in a certain way. They didn't vote on day-to-day decisions, but they did vote in support of the major decisions like who was going to lead, and they did vote for things like the overall rights and rules of their society and groups. And so the orator is an important figure because the orator represents the need to convince others to follow your opinion. So this is a classical orator pose, that hand outstretched for attention and emphasis, wearing the tunic and robe of the orator, of the politician. This will be copied later by the Roman senators and the Roman leaders. They'll wear this same kind of outfit, and this really does, this figure represents the pose of the Roman. Is cast in bronze, and it shows that they are, this is an important figure for them socially. This is not just a leader, that you don't lead by force necessarily the way the rest of the ancient world did, that what you had to do was lead based upon the strength of your ideas. And that's a really important shift and change socially. And we'll see how that plays out with the Roman Republic. Now, what we're going to look at as we move on from Etruscans is how the Etruscans were influential upon the Romans, and then how the Romans took that and transformed it for their own purposes into the establishment of Roman culture. So we'll go there in the next lecture.